I'm Andrew Baxter. I graduated from Monash University in 1990. I did a Bachelor of Business in Marketing. And I've since been lucky enough to go on to run two of the largest advertising agency groups in the country, in Ogilvy and then Publicis. And now I'm a senior advisor at KPMG's Customer Brand and Marketing Advisory practice. I mean, COVID-19 is certainly a really tough time for everybody out there. And for businesses and marketers, it's a huge challenge. I've recently wrote a couple of articles in The Australian talking through those challenges that marketers are facing. And one of the questions I'm getting is, to provide some examples of marketers and brands that have actually done, the right thing through the early stages of COVID-19. And what we found in the initial crisis, as soon as COVID hit, not just here in Australia, but around the world, was that the brands that acted authentically and with purpose, the brands that remembered that it's not just all about profits, but it's actually about their employees and the community within which they operate, their customers, they were the brands that did very well. Global brand like LVMH quickly reconfigured one of their manufacturing plants to make hand sanitizer in France. And locally, Four Pillars Gin, one of our alcohol brands, did the same thing, as did Archie Rose. Zara, one of the huge global clothing stores, it pivoted their manufacturing to make face masks and gowns, because a lot of the hospitals didn't have enough of them. And Iceland supermarkets in the UK were the first to open early hours just for the elderly who were struggling and didn't really want to get out because of all the implications of COVID-19 as a vulnerable age group. And certainly here we've seen Coles and Woolworths follow tack. And then there's been a huge amount of brands that have really tapped in and helped the health workers. Brands overseas like Crocs and Subway and McDonald's giving health workers either discounts or free things. And a lot of big media companies also repurpose their media quite quickly to make sure all the messages around washing your hands safely and social distancing got out there. And brands like Nike and Coca-Cola did that. Here locally, News Limited, they allocated $8 million of community announcements to those hibernating brands and essential services to keep the community informed as to what was going on. And oOh!media have done a couple of partnerships with their outdoor sites. One of them was they partnered with the kindness pandemic and donated some of their outdoor media to promote stories of kindness through COVID-19. They did a similar thing, for families who were going on walks during isolation. They tapped into the National Bear Hunt, which was fun, and they had little bears popping up out of the sides of their billboards. So overseas, some of the big tech companies also rallied really quickly. I think it was about 16 supercomputers were all put together from the likes of Amazon and IBM, Microsoft and Google to really fast track the analysis around the virus and working towards a vaccine and the drugs. And other brands have really done very well in providing free access to a whole lot of content, because as people are sitting at home in home isolation, they've been soaking up content in a big way. So people like the Sydney Opera House have gone and put a whole lot of their former performances that have been held in the Opera House online, and the whole full-length performances, which has been terrific. Interestingly, there's been a big shift towards people wanting to read the news, and News Corp offered free 28-day subscriptions to their online news site to help people get up to speed with all the news around COVID-19. One of the things I'm being asked a lot about during these tough times of COVID-19 is how brands are best pivoting, how they're being innovative, how they're adapting. And certainly we're seeing huge digital transformation happening rapidly. A lot of people that were thinking about doing it, retailers or halfway through it, are really fast-tracking those efforts. You're seeing at your local cafes and restaurants that's happening. Brands like Fratelli Fresh, even Grossi Florentino, the famous restaurant in Melbourne I saw the other day, have switched to selling some of their famous food online for home delivery. I mean, who wouldn't want one of Grossi's tiramisu's home delivered for $20? From a retail point of view, we're seeing a lot of Australian stores unfortunately having to close temporarily because of COVID-19. But what they have done is quickly pivot to online, and it's seen brands like Super Retail Group drive their online sales up by well over 100%. One of the other areas that I think's done really well is the exercise market. You think about gyms haven't been able to be open, neither have things like dance classes, yoga classes, but a lot of brands and organisations have quickly pivoted to go online, and people are taking dance classes, yoga classes. They're doing some of their personal training in isolation still. Same's been happening with things like book clubs. People have been having Zoom dinner parties, Zoom drinks on a Friday night. And of course, schools and universities have had to very quickly pivot to online, which has been a huge effort by many of them. The same can be said for the government. I mean, with all their initiatives that they've been offering, which has been quite incredible to keep our economy going, a lot of those applications have had to happen online. And also they've clearly created the COVID-19 app around traceability and interaction of people who might have been exposed to COVID. The health sector is one that is clearly going through a rapid change now, particularly those involved in driving the vaccine and the understanding of the virus. The other one for me has been around cooking. There's been a real push, obviously, with people in home isolation back towards cooking at home, having lunch and dinner 7 nights a week with their partners, with their families. And it's really driven a great amount of different recipes and trials, and certainly the supermarket trade is up an enormous amount because of people buying for the home. One of the other things that's very true about downturns is some of the industries that come out the other side quite well. DIY always does well, as people have a little bit less disposable income out there, more likely to do things around the home themselves, which means obviously brands like Bunnings and others may well do quite well off the back of this, and some of them are doing quite well now. Discount retailers, likewise. Fast food always seems to do well, and anything to do with creativity. These hard times often drive great creativity, whether that be in music, new art, new books, TV shows, films, fashion. Often the comedians come out the other side of this very, very well. It's also a time where doubling down on research and development is critical. There's a whole lot of examples over many, many downturns of companies who've continued to invest in R&D from a marketing point of view that have come out the other side very, very well. I mean, Apple launched iTunes and the iPod mini just after the early 2000s .com boom. Amazon launched the Kindle in the middle of the GFC. So for brands out there who are looking to get an advantage over their competitors in these tough times, really continuing to spend in that R&D space is quite important. A lot of people are talking about the fact that we seem to be hearing a lot about how big brands are doing, and not so much about smaller brands. I mentioned before the cafe and local restaurants who have pivoted quite quickly. A brand like Fratelli Fresh, who actually many years ago wasn't just a restaurant, but they had a small little grocery area in some of their original stores. For quite a few years now, they haven't had that there, particularly in their one down in the city in Walsh Bay. But what they have done is, rather than close fully, they're open for takeaway. They're putting meal packages together, and they've reopened their grocer offer. So now people at home can get restaurant quality groceries delivered to them. The other thing that I'm being asked about is around Australian made, and whether we're seeing a shift towards Australian made through COVID-19. I think what we are seeing is a heightened awareness of which products are manufactured or grown here in Australia, and which ones aren't. And I know that country of origin labelling was brought in by the government here in Australia about just under 2 years ago, which they were hoping would highlight a lot of the brands that were Australian made and get people to push toward those brands. A recent study by Nielsen actually showed, this is pre-COVID, showed that there's about 11% of customers globally who are sort of wedded on to buy only locally made products. There's about another 54% of people who said they mostly buy local products. And I think one of the trends that's starting to come out of the back of COVID-19 is a pushback to look after your local manufacturers and your local producers of goods. There's a lot of things marketers need to be considering during these COVID-19 times. And I'm seeing that this has happened in 3 phases. The first one was that initial crisis, which we're sort of through now, where no one quite knew what was going on. It happened so quickly. Businesses were almost shut down and then shut down. Some had to go into hibernation, some didn't. And I think in that initial phase, as I mentioned earlier, those brands that acted with authenticity and purpose and really looked after their customers and their employees and community came out very well. We're now into a phase where we're living with COVID and in self-isolation in Australia. And one of the key things in this period of time is to obviously make sure that you're cutting costs prudently, but also that you're starting to think about what sort of smart investments from a marketing point of view you might do. And then it's about coming out the other side of this. It's about planning for recovery. And you've got to use this time now to make sure that you're ready to come out. And there was a great example I read. There was a instant noodle brand and drinks company in China called Mastercong. And it decided through this living with COVID period to really plan for when the stores they sold their goods into reopened. And by really focusing all their efforts on tracking the reopening of those stores, they were able to outpoint their competitors, and they ended up having 3 times their stock in stores 3 times more than their competitors did through that process. And then we have 3 different types of brands that are uncovering through COVID-19. One is the booming brands. There's actually some brands that are doing really, really well. Brands, like other supermarkets where people are going down there buying a lot of goods for the home. For those, they need to continue acting quite authentically. They're in a very fortunate position and they need to have that right tone of voice. They also need to be careful that it's not just a one-off. It's not a bit of a sugar hit, that their brand's going to go through a 5 or 6 week kick and then come right off the other side. The second type of brand out there is those that I'm calling declining but surviving brands. I mean, a lot of our retailers I mentioned before are in that. Brands like Mecca and Uniqlo and Sephora, Myer, Aesop and Whitner have all had to, unfortunately, temporarily close their physical stores here in Australia, but they've all really doubled down on their online stores. And what brands who are in that sort of declining but surviving mode need to be completely customer focused, really tactical, very agile, looking for opportunities. And sadly, there's a number of hibernating brands. We've seen brands like the airlines, like some of our sporting codes, the AFL, the NRL, like some of our great music and arts organisations, have all had to unfortunately shut temporarily. And those brands need to be thinking about a couple of things. They need to be using their owned and earned media, which is effectively free, to really continue those conversations with their audiences. You see a lot of the music brands around the world, including our own Sydney Symphony Orchestra here in Australia, who are putting up content just about every day of one of the musicians at home playing a great piece, maybe someone recording it 2 different parts to a piece, putting it together, putting it up. So we're seeing a huge amount of that, which is providing some great content. You're seeing some of our top musicians, Kate Sobrano down in Melbourne, having a Friday night show with a few of her friends and music buddies, just to continue to entertain everybody. But what they also need to be cognizant of is planning for that opportunity to reopen. And brands need to understand how many weeks it's going to take to reopen. They should be setting that plan up while they're in hibernation. So if they know it's going to take 8 weeks to turn everything back on, then they need to be planning every week by week what needs to happen. Or potentially if it's only 1 or 2 weeks, they just need to have that locked down. The other big thing through all of those, whether you've got hibernating brands, declining but surviving brands, or booming brands, you really need to be customer focused. Consumer behaviour is changing enormously. Through all of this, there's going to be some changes that are permanent within consumers in certain categories. So, one of the 101s of marketing is understanding your customer. One of the interesting things for me is that there's a whole lot of research that was done in the UK in the late 2000s that showed that habits are formed in about 66 days. So if you think about it, we are probably just over halfway through those 66 days. So as a marketer, you've got an opportunity to either change habits for good for you and for your brand through this, or to stop some habits forming that might be detrimental to your brand. The other big question for marketers is how much to continue to invest, and particularly around advertising. You've seen brands like P&G and Pizza Hut come out globally and say that they're doubling down on spending in these tough times, and there's a huge amount of research that shows that's beneficial through previous downturns. P&G's been somebody that's done this a lot. Coca-Cola came out recently and said they weren't going to do that, and they weren't seeing that short-term ROI. So marketers, need to look at their category and what their KPIs are. As I said before, there is a long history of brands investing in advertising and doing well through downturns. Brands that increase their marketing spend during tough times in the past have grown their share 3 times faster afterwards. And brands that maintained or invested more in advertising during the early 1990s recession, they had a 5-year sales advantage of 25% over their competitors who did not. So there's a lot to consider for businesses in this rapidly changing environment, and there's so many different scenarios that brands are finding themselves in. But the basics of marketing will hold true through good times and tough times. So first and foremost, as I said before, focus on your customer, focus on what they need now and what they might need in the recovery phase of this downturn. Be really authentic to them. Understand their new path to purchase, if there is one, and whether any moments that matters have changed. And use the 4 Ps to guide your response. I've often say that the strength of universities in teaching is embedding the fundamentals in students as they come out of, in my case, marketing. And in marketing, those fundamentals don't change. But in a digital and technology-driven world and a COVID-interrupted world, there are now so many different ways that you can or need to execute those fundamentals. So good luck and stay safe. And please get in touch if you want to continue the conversation.